Right now, the typical white family in America has, according to the data, 15 times the net worth of the typical African-American family, 11 times that of the typical Latino and Latina family. Certainly not because we've worked harder, prayed harder, or because white folks have some superior investment wisdom. After all, a lot of really well-educated white boys lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money during the great meltdown of the economy 10 years ago. That wasn't black and brown folks. That was just white boys with really good SAT scores. And they lost 20% of the wealth of the country. So white folks don't have any superior investment wisdom. We're not better bankers, for God's sake, right? So that inequality isn't about merit. It's about a history of disparate treatment that isn't the fault of David Duke. Like, David Duke didn't create that. Richard Spencer didn't create that. Those numbers were the same before Trump. They're going to be the same after Trump, right? Democrat or Republican, those numbers remain the same. They bounce around a little bit, but it's always pretty much the same. Right? Black folks with a college degree, regardless of major, by the way. You can take a black person with a degree, white person with a degree, same degree. Right? Same area of concentration. That black person is still almost twice as likely to be out of work. Latino or Latina folk, Latinx folks with degrees, about 50% more likely than comparable whites with degrees to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with degrees, about 20% more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. Indigenous folks with degrees, 2/3 more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. Right? So whose fault is that? Like, whose responsibility is it? Maybe is the bigger question, right? David Duke didn't create it, can't take responsibility for it. Donald Trump didn't create it. Those numbers were true before he came around, and they'll be true after unless we decide to prioritize these issues. So inequalities in education, healthcare, the justice system, labor market, housing, all of that, right? These are problems with deep systemic roots. And if we're going to get a hold of them, and if we're going to get a hold of them on college campuses and create equitable spaces here as a counterweight to that, we have to at least understand that we're up against more than just the obvious, right? We're up against systems of inequality. Systems that are not, I beg to remind you, failing. Because that's the mistake that we sometimes make, right? We say things like, God, the system's broken. How do we fix it? See, no. The only way you can actually believe that the system is broken and in need of fixing on that basis is if you believe that the system was actually set up for the benefit of people of color or poor people of all colors, right? Or women as women or LGBTQ folk as such. Right? The system wasn't set up for marginalized people. That's why they're marginalized. So when the system that was never set up to serve you proceeds to let you down, that is not failure, y'all. That is the system working exactly as it was designed. So don't act shocked. Right? We have an educational system that was predicated on inequality. On purpose. It's not an accident. This is not a conspiracy theory, by the way. This is just a sociological theory called functionalism, which says that basically systems remain in place because they are functional for people with the greatest amount of power. The fact that they don't work for people without power doesn't matter because they ain't got power. That's the whole point. Right? When systems don't work for powerful people, shit changes. That's normally the way of things. When systems don't work for non-powerful people, they don't change because they don't have power. This is not rocket science. It's relatively easy. It's just observational, right? But our educational system, of which you're a part here at this institution, was set up deliberately to be unequal. How do we know? Because everybody that created it told us as such. It's not me telling you. It's not ideology. It's not politics. It's just language on a page that I can read and you can too. So Thomas Jefferson told us what the point of schooling was, y'all. Thomas Jefferson was a very forward-thinking educator, according to those who lived in his day. That's what they said. He founded the University of Virginia, very enlightened by the standards of the day when it came to the way he viewed school. What did Jefferson actually say about school? Well, this is what he said. He said what we need is about 6 years of compulsory education. And of course, he was only talking about white people, right? He didn't mean 6 years for black folks. He didn't mean 6 years for native folk, right? No, he's just talking about white people. It's like, we need 6 years of compulsory education, which I guess in the 1780s, 6 years was a lot. 6 years of compulsory schooling so that we can, his words, not mine, quote, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Oh, fascinating, right? We can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish, keeping in mind he's only talking to white people. So it's like, we know he didn't think much of black folks. We know he didn't think much of indigenous people. What he just told white folks is, I don't like any of y'all either, except for like a handful. And we're going to give you 6 years of education so we can figure out which among you were the geniuses and the rest of y'all can work for us. In other words, what he was saying was the purpose of school is inequality. This shit is not happening by accident, right? Or coincidentally. Like, this is on purpose. Which is why I always find it interesting when people tell me that education is the great equalizer, and that's why they want to be teachers, and that's why they want to get into the education game, because we know you don't do it for money. We know you don't do it for prestige, right? You don't do it for power. Everybody says, oh, education's the equalizer. Where? Where's the evidence of that? Not only is the data that I gave you a contradiction to the idea that it's an equalizer, but the people that were setting up the system from the jump told you that was not the point. It's about inequality. Fast forward, because I don't want Jefferson to be an anomaly. Fast forward to the early 1900s, and Woodrow Wilson, before he becomes president of the United States, is president of Princeton. He also was considered a very progressive educational theoretician. He wasn't quite on the level of Dewey and some of those, but he was still someone to whom a lot of educators looked for theories about schooling and best practices. And what did Woodrow Wilson say? He said something very similar to Jefferson. He said, what we need is a small group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education, that being the term that we once used for college education. And he said, what we need by necessity in this and every other society is a much larger group that will forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. Fascinating, right? I mean, break that down. It's pretty much what Jefferson said, updated a little bit, right? A little bit different language. But ultimately what he said was, the point is we need a handful of folks to rule, the rest of y'all work for us. The purpose of education is inequality, not equality. Now, lest you believe that this is a philosophy that died in the early part of the 20th century and has somehow changed, let's fast forward again. We'll go to 2001, late 01, maybe early 02. George W. Bush is president. No Child Left Behind is passed, right? The big educational reform bill. I'm watching a Sunday talk show. William Bennett is on, former Secretary of Education under Reagan, who until recently was the worst Secretary of Education in American history. But, you know, records are meant to be broken, y'all. Like, Lou Gehrig used to have the longest run of consecutive games in baseball, and even that fell. Nobody thought that one was going to fall. Nobody really thought Bill Bennett would get knocked from his perch as the worst Secretary of Education, but amazingly, it has happened. But he is holding on tight at number 2. And there he was on the talk show, and they asked him a question as the former Secretary of Education. They said, Mr. Secretary, what do you think?
Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, Africans. I hope you are faring well where you are, and if you ain't faring well, please fare well where you are. Now, in today's video, we want to talk about Tim Wise. Again, I love Tim Wise. He's a wise man, you know. And in this video, Tim Wise is trying to explain to us why it is important to try and practice the act of being an anti-racist. In fact, he says that being an anti-racist is not easy. It's a hard thing, you know, because you have to unlearn things that your family, you have to unlearn things that generations were able to feed into the minds of your family, and then it has now become a tradition and a culture. Just the same way it's hard to forget your tradition and culture, it's the same way Tim Wise is likening the steps towards becoming an anti-racist. So he first gives some points that I want us to highlight before we dive into the real video. He gives some points on oversimplification of racial matters. Tim Wise warns against oversimplification of matters, you know. He says that let us not judge others, you know, while we ourselves are guilty. Many times we see people like Trump are the ones who are racist. But let me tell you, we have systemic oppression and individual oppression, the same way we have systemic racism, and then we have individual racism. Trump might be on the scale of systemic racism, but inside the house, those homes in America where we have white people who are not loving of other people, they might be having a step towards individual racism. So it's not only Trump who is dangerous. You who is even hiding in your house, you might be the most dangerous even than Trump. Tim Wise tells us so. The second one is, it is easier to blame Trump, but we have our home ridden with racism, tradition, and inequalities. That one I've said. Now, he also tells us that white people gentrifies weed. You listen to him say that. He also talks about system. The system was deliberately set unequal to oppress the black minority in America. He also talks to us about the purpose of school. And he tells us that education was invented for oppression. Yes, I know you might disagree with this, but sometimes if you want to learn new things, you need to unlearn things, then relearn. Then the process of unlearning and relearning is called learning. You see? Remove everything that is impossible, then whatever you are left with, however improbable you think they are, you see that will always be the truth, right? So you do that. You'll find that Tim Weiss is saying education in America, and I think the rest of the world, was designed for oppression, and it was designed to favor a certain group of people with whom you know. America was not made for the black Americans. It was made for the whites. Tim Weiss tells us more and more about this video. I want us to dive in, listen to him one-on-one. I shall give you my thoughts by the end of the video, where we shall also have a deep critical analysis. Let's dive in.
The issues about which I was speaking 25 and 30 years ago, and about which many of you were speaking at least that long ago, if not longer, are still very much with us, and oddly enough, shockingly, have not been resolved. I'm sure we're all heartily surprised by the lack of ability of our country to actually, over the course of the last 3 decades, eliminate and eradicate institutional white supremacy. If you are shocked by that, you're probably in the wrong room. I'm going to assume that you sort of expected it would be that way. But when you do this work for long enough, you do start to, you play this game with your head where you really want to try to figure out why it is. I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge that we haven't solved the problem. I mean, that's sort of obvious, right? But then you have to sort of come up with a reason. What is it? Because we're smart people, sort of, right? I mean, we try. We play at it on our better days, and we're committed people. I think most people are pretty good. Well-intended folks. I mean, there are some people out there, duly noted, who are exceptions to that general observation. But I think, on balance, I think most people are pretty good, don't wake up in the morning wanting to oppress or marginalize people. And yet, oppression and marginalization still happens. And in spite of our best intentions and our intelligence, we seem to be lacking in the ability to figure out the sort of way to crack the code, right? To figure out how we're going to really create equity, in spite of our intentions and in spite of our efforts and in spite of money thrown at the issue over the years. So then the question becomes, what's up, right? What is it that we're really up against? What is it that's preventing us from obtaining equity, whether that is on a particular campus or in a certain college system, or whether it's in a city or a state or a nation? And I think one of the things that I've come to recognize is that one of our problems is we tend to oversimplify that which we're up against. And we try to simplify it in a way that protects some of us from judgment by casting that judgment upon certain others as if they alone were the problem. And I think we do this a lot in this country, and we certainly have done it since Charlottesville. And you do it here, and, well, some folks make it easy for you here in Portland, right? It's very easy to decide who the good guys and bad guys are, or to think that you know who the good guys and bad guys are when you have fools like the Proud Boys and Patriot Prayer and Joey Gibson marching around, right, demanding they be listened to. Joey apparently having forgotten what the Bible says about prayer, that it ought to be done in the closet and not on the streets of Portland. So his organization, Patriot Prayer, isn't really paying attention to their own biblical admonitions, but that's not the only thing to which they don't pay much attention. And yet it's so easy, isn't it, to say, well, the Proud Boys are the problem, and Joey Gibson is the problem, and those boys in Charlottesville are the problem, right? Richard Spencer, who had an epic meltdown that was released on social media yesterday, just to remind you that even the most erudite intellectual of Nazis is still, interestingly, a Nazi at heart, and given the chance, will indeed engage in the most vitriolic and genocidal of rhetoric. So you don't really have the opportunity or the luxury of being fooled by people just because they pretend to be intellectual in their racism. And yet it's so easy to say it's about Richard Spencer and David Duke or even Donald Trump, isn't it? It's so easy to pretend that the problem of racism and racial inequity is something that if we could just sort of get rid of those boys in Charlottesville with their tiki torches, right? Because let's be honest, like nothing says white supremacy like a bunch of 23-year-old white boys in khakis and polo shirts marching around with oversized Polynesian candles that they bought at Pier 1. Like nothing says badass like that, right? But if we can just get rid of them, if we can just figure out a way to defeat them, if we can just figure a way to get a certain presidential candidate or sitting president out of office, and all the problems of racial inequity will go away. It's certainly tempting to believe that. It's certainly tempting to believe that we can draw this sort of line and say, okay, here are the bad people over here, they're white supremacists and Klansmen and neo-Nazis and that kind of thing, and here are the good people over here, and we're open-minded and progressive. But here's the thing, right? Well, first of all, here's the thing. First time I came to Portland, I was picked up at the airport by a young man, young African-American student, who was driving me around, heading back to the campus where I was going to be speaking, and he asked me, he's like a sophomore in college at the time at Lewis and Clark, and he said to me, just take a guess, Tim, how many times I've been stopped by police in this town driving my car? He said, keep in mind, I didn't have the car on campus first year, so I've only had it this year. And this was like 8 months in, near the end of the semester, right? He said, how many times do you think I've been stopped? Right? Here in Portland, keeping in mind those of us not from Portland, were led to believe, as we were about the Bay Area, as we were about Seattle, as we were about all of those kind of, when we're from the South, right, you get the impression all these other places are just progressive nirvana, right? It's the place to be. And this black man's asking me, how many times do you think I've been stopped? I said, I don't know, 10, 12? Which to me would have been a pretty shitty, horrible answer, right? That would have been awful, 10 or 12 times in the course of 8 months. He's like, no, 63. I said, how many times did you get a ticket? Because I knew the follow-up question I wanted to ask, right? I knew the question I had to ask him in response. How many times did you get a ticket? He said, not once. I said, of course not, because you didn't do anything. Right? Because if you'd done something, you would have gotten a ticket. That tells you a lot about the supposedly open-minded and progressive Northwest and the progressive nirvana of Portland, right? Where I can go into weed shops run by white weed billionaires while black and brown folks still rot in jail for selling the same product without an occupational license and a storefront because daddy couldn't buy it for him. And I can ride out from the airport on one of those side roads where they all have all the bulletin boards for the weed shops, right? And I see that like Cheech Marin has his own weed strain, awesome. Tommy Chong has his own weed strain, awesome, right? And they're talking about, you go into a weed shop, it's like they're pairing it with cheese and shit. Like, I don't know. Like they're tasting notes for weed. Because here's the thing, and Portlanders will appreciate this, white people have gentrified weed. So see, that ain't Nazis, is it? Like all the dudes running weed shops, they didn't go to Charlottesville and march around with tiki torches. They're on the left, they're progressive, they're selling weed, right? But they're still taking advantage of a market of inequality that continues to plague people of color and benefit white folks. So who's the good guy and who's the bad? See, the lines aren't always that clear, and I get nervous when we're able to point to obvious demons. I get real nervous when it's easy, when certain people make it easy. The Proud Boys make it easy. Man, they're fascist. It's so easy, right? Patriot Prayer, they're just fascists. They just make it easy. They're just hateful, misogynistic goons. It's so easy to just say that and move on. It's so easy to talk about Trump or David Duke or Richard Spencer, and I know those three are not the same, by the way. I'm very clear on the differences between them. I'm not trying to elide those differences. I know that Donald Trump is not David Duke, and that David Duke is not Richard Spencer, and Richard Spencer is not Gavin McInnes, and Gavin McInnes is not Joy Gibson. I get it, but they all sort of push this obvious politic of prejudice, but the only reason it works, right? The only reason it works is because there's a pathogen in the larger body politic that we all share. If that weren't true, it wouldn't work. You couldn't make bank economically or politically talking in those terms and speaking in that way. You couldn't gain a following or a prominence if it was just you and your boys, right? Like at some point there has to be something deeper, some virus residing in the larger body politic that we share. That's on us. Right now, the typical white family in America has, according to the data, 15 times the net worth of the typical African-American family, 11 times that of the typical Latino and Latina family. Certainly not because we've worked harder, prayed harder, or because white folks have some superior investment wisdom. After all, a lot of really well-educated white boys lost $12.5 trillion of other people's money during the great meltdown of the economy 10 years ago. That wasn't black and brown folks. That was just white boys with really good SAT scores. And they lost 20% of the wealth of the country. So white folks don't have any superior investment wisdom. We're not better bankers, for God's sake, right? So that inequality isn't about merit. It's about a history of disparate treatment that isn't the fault of David Duke. Like, David Duke didn't create that. Richard Spencer didn't create that. Those numbers were the same before Trump. They're going to be the same after Trump, right? Democrat or Republican, those numbers remain the same. They bounce around a little bit, but it's always pretty much the same. Right? Black folks with a college degree, regardless of major, by the way. You can take a black person with a degree, white person with a degree, same degree, right? Same area of concentration. That black person is still almost twice as likely to be out of work. Latino or Latina folk, Latinx folks with degrees, about 50% more likely than comparable whites with degrees to be out of work. Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders with degrees, about 20% more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. Indigenous folks with degrees, 2/3 more likely than whites with degrees to be out of work. Right? So whose fault is that? Like, whose responsibility is it? Maybe is the bigger question, right? David Duke didn't create it, can't take responsibility for it. Donald Trump didn't create it. Those numbers were true before he came around, and they'll be true after unless we decide to prioritize these issues. So inequalities in education, healthcare, the justice system, labor market, housing, all of that, right? These are problems with deep systemic roots. And if we're going to get a hold of them, and if we're going to get a hold of them on college campuses and create equitable spaces here as a counterweight to that, we have to at least understand that we're up against more than just the obvious, right? We're up against systems of inequality. Systems that are not, I beg to remind you, failing. Because that's the mistake that we sometimes make, right? We say things like, God, the system's broken. How do we fix it? See, no. The only way you can actually believe that the system is broken and in need of fixing on that basis is if you believe that the system was actually set up for the benefit of people of color or poor people of all colors, right? Or women as women or LGBTQ folk as such. Right? The system wasn't set up for marginalized people. That's why they're marginalized. So when the system that was never set up to serve you proceeds to let you down, that is not failure, y'all. That is the system working exactly as it was designed. So don't act shocked. Right? We have an educational system that was predicated on inequality. On purpose. It's not an accident. This is not a conspiracy theory, by the way. This is just a sociological theory called functionalism, which says that basically systems remain in place because they are functional for people with the greatest amount of power. The fact that they don't work for people without power doesn't matter because they ain't got power. That's the whole point. Right? When systems don't work for powerful people, shit changes. That's normally the way of things. When systems don't work for non-powerful people, they don't change because they don't have power. This is not rocket science. It's relatively easy. It's just observational, right? But our educational system, of which you're a part here at this institution, was set up deliberately to be unequal. How do we know? Because everybody that created it told us as such. It's not me telling you. It's not ideology. It's not politics. It's just language on a page that I can read and you can too. So Thomas Jefferson told us what the point of schooling was, y'all. Thomas Jefferson was a very forward-thinking educator, according to those who lived in his day. That's what they said. He founded the University of Virginia, very enlightened by the standards of the day when it came to the way he viewed school. And what did Jefferson actually say about school? Well, this is what he said. He said, what we need is about 6 years of compulsory education. And of course, he was only talking about white people, right? He didn't mean 6 years for black folks. He didn't mean 6 years for native folk, right? No, he's just talking about white people. It's like, we need 6 years of compulsory education, which I guess in the 1780s, 6 years was a lot. 6 years of compulsory schooling so that we can, his words, not mine, quote, rake a few geniuses from the rubbish. Oh, fascinating, right? We can rake a few geniuses from the rubbish, keeping in mind he's only talking to white people. So it's like, we know he didn't think much of black folks. We know he didn't think much of indigenous people. What he just told white folks is, I don't like any of y'all either, except for like a handful. And we're going to give you 6 years of education so we can figure out which among you were the geniuses and the rest of y'all can work for us. In other words, what he was saying was the purpose of school is inequality. This shit is not happening by accident, right? Or coincidentally. Like, this is on purpose. Just why I always find it interesting when people tell me that education is the great equalizer, and that's why they want to be teachers, and that's why they want to get into the education game, because we know you don't do it for money. We know you don't do it for prestige, right? You don't do it for power. Everybody says, oh, education's the equalizer. Where? Where's the evidence of that? Not only is the data that I gave you a contradiction to the idea that it's an equalizer, but the people that were setting up the system from the jump told you that was not the point. It's about inequality. Fast forward, because I don't want Jefferson to be an anomaly. Fast forward to the early 1900s, and Woodrow Wilson, before he becomes president of the United States, is president of Princeton. He also was considered a very progressive educational theoretician. He wasn't quite on the level of Dewey and some of those, but he was still someone to whom a lot of educators looked for theories about schooling and best practices. And what did Woodrow Wilson say? He said something very similar to Jefferson. He said, what we need is a small group of people to prepare themselves for the receipt of a liberal education, that being the term that we once used for college education. And he said, what we need by necessity in this and every other society is a much larger group that will forego the privilege of a liberal education and prepare themselves for the performance of certain difficult manual tasks. Fascinating, right? I mean, break that down. It's pretty much what Jefferson said, updated a little bit, right? A little bit different language. But ultimately what he said was, the point is we need a handful of folks to rule, the rest of y'all work for us. The purpose of education is inequality, not equality. Now, lest you believe that this is a philosophy that died in the early part of the 20th century and has somehow changed, let's fast forward again. We'll go to 2001, late 01, maybe early 02. George W. Bush is president. No Child Left Behind is passed, right? The big educational reform bill. I'm watching a Sunday talk show. William Bennett is on, former Secretary of Education under Reagan, who until recently was the worst Secretary of Education in American history. But, you know, records are meant to be broken, y'all. Like, Lou Gehrig used to have the longest run of consecutive games in baseball, and even that fell. Nobody thought that one was going to fall. Nobody really thought Bill Bennett would get knocked from his perch as the worst Secretary of Education, but amazingly, it has happened. But he is holding on tight at number 2. And there he was on the talk show, and they asked him a question as the former Secretary of Education. They said, Mr. Secretary, what do you think the biggest problem in education today is? Now that, y'all, is that's a pretty big question, right? It's the kind of question that if somebody asked you that, you'd probably think, oh, I want to think about that for a minute. Can we go to commercial? Maybe we'll come back, talk about that in a minute. Like, I'm pretty confident about my answers, but I still think that's awfully big, right? I don't want to give a bad answer to a question like that. So I would need some time. Bill Bennett did not need time. Bill Bennett was ready with his answer, and I'll remind you of the question, what do you think the biggest problem in education today is? Bill Bennett, without missing a beat, says the biggest problem is too many people are going to college. Period. Not comma, not like internal ellipses like there's more shit coming, right? Like that, there could have been an ellipses in there. There could have been an M dash, a semicolon, a comma, something. Like maybe he was wanting to say too many people going to college, comma, who can't afford it, or M dash, or what. I'm bad at grammar. I'm a writer. I've written 7 books, but I have editors for that shit. Like whatever. The point is, like there's nothing. There's no comma, no semicolon, no M dash. There's nothing. There's certainly no ... It's just a period at the end of the sentence. Too many people going to college. And I'm thinking, whoa, who in the world is he talking about? Right? Because he didn't say, see? But that's the obvious question, which they did not ask him as a follow-up. I'm like, why? Why didn't we ask that question? Because I want to know what the answer is. But then again, I realize I do know the answer. Right? Because come on, who do we know he's not talking about? He's certainly not talking about the mediocre, rich and mediocre children of rich and mediocre parents who themselves came from rich and mediocre people. I've known plenty of rich and mediocre people over the course of my life, lots of them, right? Used to be able to go to the Ivy League and get a gentleman's C without even going to class. As long as you were from the right family and you were white male and Protestant from the East Coast, you didn't have to show up, man. Right? So you could be mediocre. It didn't matter, man. You could get C's in prep school, go to Yale, get C's at Yale, go to Harvard Business School, get C's there, go on to become president of the United States. I'll let y'all Google that one. Or you can get $400 million worth of cash in real estate from your daddy and be a millionaire by the time you're 8 years old. And then 70 years later, folks are still acting like you're a self-made billionaire. I'll let you Google that one too. All right? So we're not talking about the rich and mediocre, of whom there are scores. They're going to go to college, and we all know they're going to go to college, and they've always gone to college. Never have I ever met a counselor at a prep school, right, who showed up at the counseling office near the end of the senior year of the graduating seniors at the prep school and sat down with the C students and said, okay, so I know you have your heart set on university and maybe law school and med school, but have you ever thought about working in a factory? Because I think maybe your academic prowess suggests that's what you're suited for. Maybe minimum wage job. You ever think about that? No, of course not. Those people are going to run the universe. So when Bill Bennett says too many people are going to college, he sure as hell is not talking about them. Who's he talking about? He's talking about working class people of all colors. He's talking about people of color in particular. He's talking about the kind of people that go to community colleges. He's talking about the people who in prior generations wouldn't have had access to education and for whom he doesn't care much for access now. He doesn't have to say it. It's obvious. It's the mentality of the slave owner, right? What was the mentality of the slave owner? The mentality of the slave owner was, if they all learn to read, who's going to pick this cotton, y'all? Right? And so if they all go to college, right, who's going to pick up my garbage on Wednesday? And who's going to change the bedpans at the hospital? And who's going to change my sheets at my hotel tonight, right? Because if you get a college degree, you'll think you're too good for that work. Because that's what they basically tell us is, you're too good for certain work, right? Even though that work is like vital, right? The garbage collection thing, sort of vital, sort of important. We don't pay it like it's very important, but the two guys that pick up my trash once a week in Nashville, like, they get about $19.5, maybe $20, $21. If there's been a raise that I'm not aware of, and then some benefits that probably aren't all that great. And they do like the most important work in the neighborhood. Like if they don't show up for 6 weeks, we got like bubonic plague on my block, y'all. Like people are dying. People are just falling out dead. People are just, I wouldn't know where the dump is. I don't even know where to take my own garbage. I'd just look at my wife and be like, I don't know. I guess we're just all going to die. I don't know where to take it. I don't know where the recycle is. What are you talking about? Right? But they get paid like 20 grand a year to know stuff like that and do stuff like that. And meanwhile, the dude that lives like 5 houses down and sells stock, come on, man. If he doesn't show up for 6 weeks, world will go on. Nobody's going to miss him. That stock will get sold and traded by somebody else. But the garbage folks don't come, right? And people die. So we have a labor market predicated on inequality. If you have a labor market predicated on inequality structured into the system, you have to have a school system predicated on inequality to fill those job slots. Again, not conspiratorial, just systemic functionalism, right? So what that means is if you're working in a college setting, particularly a community college setting, you have to remember that the folks who are entering through your doors as students are at the 13-year mark of a system that was established for the purpose of crushing most people. And if you're going to be about creating equity at this point of the game, there's a lot of damage that has to be undone, and to undo it, you have to see it, and you have to address it, and you have to name it, right? You have to name that damage, and that damage wasn't done by Nazis and Klansmen. That damage was done by the best and the brightest college-educated people, right? Who, in spite of their education and their erudition, did horrible things in the name of inequality. That's why I'm always fascinated by the focus we have on STEM, right, within our colleges and even within our K-12 now, science, tech, engineering, and math. I get it. It's important. Science is important. We need scientists if we're going to stave off ecological catastrophe. It's sort of important. Technology, you know, it can be good or bad, but on balance, I'm glad we have some. Engineering, yeah, it's very important. I like my bridges not to collapse. And I fly all the time, and I don't understand aviation, so I'm glad somebody does, right? Math, very important. I'm glad that some of y'all good at and love math. It wasn't going to be this boy, but I'm glad y'all like it. Right? I'm glad somebody knows how to do it. But here's the problem, right? If we only focus on STEM in our colleges, and our K-12, and we make that sort of the focal point of education, which I fear we're doing because we're so concerned about global competitiveness, and we're saying to young people, these are the best paying jobs of the future, and you need to be prepared for one. Cool, but here's the problem, right? Technology, right, can be used to liberate or to marginalize and to oppress. And I'm afraid that if we only focus on science, tech, engineering, and math, or overly so, we'll end up 20 years out with a lot of really well-educated tech bros who can code all day long, and maybe some women as well if we really open up the ranks of STEM the way we need to. But those tech bros and those tech women who end up in the same field can code and code and code, but they won't know how to function as members of a pluralistic, multicultural democracy. They won't know how to be citizens. I don't mean of this country, I mean of this planet. They won't know how to maintain systems of even remotely democratic institutions. So we got to do some other stuff, right? We got to focus on some other things. We have to make sure that STEM is combined with what I would call mesh education. M for media literacy, E for ethics, S for sociology, H for history. Right? Why? Let's think about it. M for media literacy. Well, we have young people, and even not so young people. We're being bombarded with more media imagery than ever. It's really important that people know how to sift through the bullshit and separate the wheat from the chaff. And I don't just mean in political campaigns, although that's important. I mean even just in advertising, right? Being able to ascertain when corporations are trying to manipulate you to buy products that you don't need with clever advertising and marketing, which is certainly part of our everyday experience. So having some media savvy, some media literacy to know when you're being manipulated around political themes, social themes, cultural themes, commercial themes, very important. Right? Learning how to use social media in a responsible way. At a time like this, very important to have that. Has to be taught, doesn't come naturally. The technology is evolving much faster than our brains, right? So we have to sort of intervene and teach this stuff and really learn this stuff. E for ethics. Just about every division that roils us in this country and on the planet, right, has an ethical dilemma at its heart. How do we balance off the need for ecological sustainability with the need for economic opportunity? How do we balance off this versus that? There's any number of things you can probably think of, right, where ethical decisions are in play. But when is the last time most of us really sat down and thought seriously about ethical dilemmas and tried to resolve them? If you took a philosophy class, maybe, if that was your major, sure. Maybe you do some of that if you're a person of faith in your house of worship. Maybe you'll have some of those conversations. But for the most part, we don't really engage young people and students around ethics. We leave that to, like, you know, the philosophers, assuming we can't be that, right? That we can't be part of that philosophical and ethical tradition, critical thinking tradition. But we must. S for sociology. How are you going to make sense of the world that you find if you don't understand sociology, if you don't have a sociological imagination? Right? Which is to say, if I don't understand power dynamics and the dynamics between socially defined groups, I'm not going to be able to make sense of inequality. I'm not going to be able to make sense of the way elections run, the way the economy runs, the way culture operates, right? We don't just operate as individuals bouncing off others, right? Like just atoms, rotating around. We also operate within systems as groups, as members of groups. And understanding the power dynamics between us is how I can understand everything from the impact of gentrification to the way the criminal justice system operates, to the way that tracking in K-12 schools operates, right? I have to have a sociological context for what I see, because otherwise, you know what happens. We all grow up in a society where we're told the same thing. This society tells every one of us wherever you end up is all about your own effort, right? That's the social gospel of America. That's Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism. Well, if you tell me that, and then I look around and I see massive inequality between rich and poor, between men and women, in the job market, for instance, between white and people of color, if I see massive inequality and you told me that wherever I end up is all about my own effort and anybody can make it if they try, and you don't break down that ideology by looking at the sociological and historical context that got in the way of it being true, then my default position is going to be classist and racist and sexist. Oh, well, I guess they're here because they're just better, and I guess they're here because they're inferior. That becomes almost logical. Again, David Duke doesn't even have to exist, y'all. Richard Spencer doesn't have to exist. Donald Trump doesn't have to exist. None of these people have to exist. All you have to do in order to internalize racial and racist, classist and sexist norms in this country is to be in this country and be taught the lessons that we're all taught and learn them. and not learn to interrogate them. Sociology allows you to interrogate them by giving you some context. History does as well. That's the H in MESH, right? This idea that we need better historical memory. Our history, pedagogical approach is abysmal in this country. What do? We just teach people a bunch of disconnected names and dates and battles, and we have them regurgitate it. Not all history teachers. I mean, some do a great job, but that's what we do pretty much K-12, so by the time they get to college, that's where most students have been. And they hate history. You ask most high school graduates, like, what was your least favorite class? History. I wouldn't have said that because I was a history geek, but that's what most people say because it's just taught in this way that's utterly disconnected from their lived experience, right? Because it doesn't seem to have any relevance. I mean, more people grow up in this country believing that lie about George Washington and the cherry tree, right? You know that story, right? Oh, George Washington cut down a cherry tree. He was just so honest. He was just such an honest little boy that he went, Daddy, 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 I cannot tell a lie. I cut down the cherry tree in the front yard because I can't lie. Well, apparently historians didn't have any such compunction because they did. That story is a lie. That shit did not happen. There's not a single historian with any documented evidence of that story ever happening, but more people know that story than know that George Washington owned other human beings and was a particularly vicious slave owner, in fact, particularly vicious in his treatment of his chattel property. But we don't know that story, but we know the cherry tree story because that's more functional for the people in power to say, we have almost like deities as founders. It's almost godlike how our country came to be. It was just struck off from the forehead of God Almighty. Right? Rather than actually understanding how we came to be here. So if we don't have a proper historical understanding, sociological understanding, ethical grounding, and media literacy, all the STEM in the world isn't going to help us because that technology can be used to oppress and to marginalize. It has before. That's why we need mesh within STEM. Even if you're teaching science, you better have a mesh understanding of science because science has been weaponized against marginalized people. Science was used to justify the extermination of peoples both on this continent and in Europe during World War II. All of the things the Nazis did, they borrowed from our scientists, our academics, our professors who were ensconced at Harvard and Yale and Princeton and Stanford and Columbia. They didn't come up with any of that on their own. Those were American scientists, the best and the brightest, and that was the thinking that led to genocide in Europe, and it was the thinking that led to the involuntary sterilization of 100,000 women in this country in the 20th century against their will because they were deemed too imbecilic to reproduce. Most of them people of color, but a lot of poor white women as well. Right now, think about why that would be important to teach me. Like if you're wanting to diversify STEM, which is something we talk about, right? We talk about that. We talk about the importance of making sure that folks of color and women of all colors have access to STEM. I think one of the ways you might inspire folks to go into STEM is not just by telling them there's a good job waiting for you, because nobody trusts that anymore in this economy. Nobody believes that shit. The idea there's a good job waiting for you just because you worked hard and got an education, man. Folks can look around and see folks with graduate degrees waiting tables. They don't believe that. Right? Or saying, oh, it's about global competition. Nobody cares. But if I'm a person you're trying to inspire to go into STEM, and I'm a person of color, I'm a woman of any color, I'm working class, maybe the way to do it is to say, like, yeah, you sort of need to know this because if you don't know it, the people who do know it might kill you with it. How about that? How about it can be weaponized against you? How about this is self-defense? How about this is collective liberation? How about you need to know this better than they know this so they cannot use it against you the way they always have? How about that? See, that's going to get me in the game. That's going to actually make me realize, like, oh, this isn't just something you're telling me I have to learn because the state standards or, or because I've got this requirement to graduate with my associate's degree or my bachelor's degree. It's actually because this has some deep connection to my life. That's what education is supposed to be about, but we have so individualized it, right? We've sort of individualized education to where it's all about you got to get yours so you can get out there and get a good job, and that's the purpose of education. Right? But when you individualize education, you strip it of all of its collective and social and cultural meaning. For marginalized people, it doesn't make any sense to talk about it in a purely individualized sense because for marginalized peoples, I'm talking working class folks, regardless of color. I'm talking people of color. I'm talking women as women. I'm talking any group that's been marginalized to sit there and think about getting yours and getting out is to turn your back on the larger social project of group uplift. And during periods of intense oppression, like under segregation, think about that. Like, black folks under segregation is just one example. Right? It would have been really weird, right, to have a philosophy of education that said the purpose of schooling is to be more successful as an individual so you can get a good job and support your family, right? Because you were only going to be able to rise so high under that system. So the idea that that would be your motivation is nuts, right? Now that would make no sense. So under segregation, people of color had to actually have a collective philosophy of what schooling was for, that it was about group uplift, all of us or none of us, right? Either we all rise or none of us rise. The problem is when we integrated the bodies and we integrated the buildings, we didn't integrate the philosophy. So we left the dominant individualistic philosophy in our schools, and then we made it more multicultural, but we were asking all these collective folks who have a collective philosophy of social uplift to come into our individualized places and make it all about them. And we have teachers who I've heard many times, as young as like middle school, telling their middle school students, and I think they mean well, when they talk to kids this way, they mean like, they'll say things like, you need to get a good education so you can get out of here and make something of yourself. The hell does that mean? So you can get out of here and make something of yourself. And you think you're doing a kid a favor when you say that. Like, this is your ticket out. Ticket out of what? The only place you've ever known and the people who loved you? When you say that, what you just said to that child is the place you come from is broke and busted and no count, and your goal should be to leave all the people there in the dust, not to come back and fight for them, not to come back and work with them to liberate the neighborhood you come from or improve the neighborhood, but just to get the hell out and let the gentrifiers claim it. Right? And everybody that you think loved you, they didn't love you. They loved you that had gotten you out of there. That's the implicit subtext. Right? That's a horrible thing. And we don't just tell it to kids of color. We tell that to young working class white folks that live in rural areas too. You got to get out of here. And then they do. They leave, right? Because they're trying to get out, right? And then the folks they left behind are like, well, why is our neighborhood dying? Why is our town dying? Because y'all were encouraging people to get out and make something of themselves instead of come back and fight for the collective good of the people in the communities that they come from. So this individualized notion of what schooling is about is just an incredibly dangerous thing, and it's not inspiring. People just aren't really inspired by it. It just doesn't work, especially when they can look around and they can see people with educations that haven't gotten very far, and they can see people who don't have that much education who are some of the richest people on the planet. Like Zuckerberg left Harvard, right? He said, screw it. Don't even need it. And a lot of the folks in Silicon Valley, same way, like, screw it, I don't have to do this. Right? Because if I got the right connections, I really don't have to do this. Everybody knows that that's the way the system operates. But the key is for us, if we're going to create equity, we have to meet folks at that level of their own recognition of that knowledge and say to them that the purpose of this education here at this institution is not about just helping you as an individual. It is all of us or none. Right? It is this whole community or it is nobody. That's especially what community colleges have to be about. Right? And that means recognizing that the problem is an overall mindset. It's our overarching paradigm, not given to us by white supremacists in the traditional sense, but just given to us by white supremacy as an overarching philosophy, given to us by a society that's always been predicated on that, and class inequality, and gender inequality, and all these forms of inequality, and recognizing that our task is to rebel against that. To be an educator in that society is to be a revolutionary or a collaborator, and there's no in between. There's no other choice. It is one or the other. You are either working to liberate people from systems of marginality, or you are keeping them in place. And the only question for us at this particular point is, what side are we going to be on? So we have to recognize the problem is not out there, it's all around us. It isn't about bad people and good people, it's about bad systems and how bad systems can contort good people. Like I said, I think most people are good. But if you're a good person in a bad and iniquitous system, you're going to have a hell of a time producing goodness on the other end. If you're standing at the end of a conveyor belt in a sausage factory, don't be shocked, in other words, when it gives you sausage every time. Right? If you're standing at the end of that conveyor belt waiting for chicken nuggets, you're going to be waiting a long time. Where are my chicken nuggets? I don't know. Did you read the sign, fool? It is a sausage factory. It is going to give you exactly what it told you it was going to give. But I really want chicken. Then you need to retool the damn machinery. Right? This is not a glitch. You know, you think about it in like phone terms, right? It's like if education in America was an app, it's not a glitch. It's not a bug. It's a feature. It is programmed into the app. There's no update coming. There's no patch coming, right? There's no version 2.0. This is it. It's just version 1. Always one. Until you actually retool the software, maybe even the hardware, right? But that requires a different mentality. That requires looking at education as a revolutionary act, committing to a mission that is community-based, and particularly in community colleges, being clear and unwavering about that commitment, especially in the face of those who would challenge it, especially in the face of those who would, in this present day, make those who are immigrants particularly, but not only undocumented people, feel so insecure, those who are Muslim, but not only Muslim, feel so insecure, those who are LGBTQ feel so insecure, but not only them, women as well, people of color generally. And these folks who will try to come on your campuses and claim the right to be here under the guise of free speech, forgetting for a minute that although speech may indeed be free, that doesn't mean it has to be worthless. I'll let you think about that aphorism for a minute. Just because speech is free doesn't mean that it has to be worthless. And sometimes it is just that. And when certain groups come around and they yell racial slurs and they taunt and they cajole, that's not a speech act. That's not an argument. The whole purpose of free speech is to forward an argument that can be rebutted. It is to engage in the search for truth. Racial slurs are not part of a search for truth. Gendered slurs are not part of a search for truth. Sexualized slurs are not part of a search for truth. They are not rebuttable presumptions. They are not rebuttable by anything except maybe medication or a fist to the teeth, the latter of which will get you locked up, the former of which you cannot do involuntarily. So, the idea that that speech needs to be defended, there may be a constitutional reality to that, but I'll tell you what, if you spend more time defending the free speech of racists than you do condemning their racism, your priorities are messed up. That much I know for sure, right? And yet that's what we have. We have people who will defend the free speech of fascists, and I acknowledge it exists, but I'm also going to spend more time critiquing fascism than defending the free speech of people who rock that mentality. That's because I got my priorities straight. We have a lot of people who don't. We have to be clear. We have to have administrators and professors and staff all the way from top to bottom who say when those folks come around, as they surely will if they have not already, you may have a right to be here, but we will condemn you in no uncertain terms. We will leave no question as to where we stand. We will not simply say, this violates the norms and the values of our community. No, we will show some emotion. We will show some anger. We will show some real hostility at the fact that you think you have the right to come around us and make our students unsafe. We have the right to be every bit as emotional and every bit as angry as you are, and our anger is righteous and yours is destructive. And so it isn't enough to issue mealy-mouthed platitudes or emails or letters that go around a campus. It's about standing up and saying, damn it, you are not welcome here. You may have the right to be here, but we will make your life hell because we have free speech too, see? You have the right to be an asshole and we have the right to call you one. That's how this works. So you need to get used to that. Free speech is not consequence-free speech. But, and I want to make sure we're clear on this, it isn't enough to just speak to those people because, like I said at the outset, they're not the only problem, right? They only can be as successful as they are because the rest of our society is so predicated on inequality. If you were taught that wherever you end up is all about you, and then you see inequality, of course, you'll come to some of the same conclusions those folks come to. Right? Maybe not at the same level, maybe it'll be subconscious, but it's going to be there, so we got to work on ourselves too. Right? We can't just work on our institutions, and we can't just work on trying to change the mentality of fascist and overt racist. We also have to work on us. And the reason I know this, and I'll close with this, some of you know this story, most of you won't. So I tell this story sometimes at the beginning of my speeches, but it seems to fit here, and then I'll be done and take some questions. My grandmother was a very instrumental person in my life. Lots of reasons. First, because she was the person in her home, and my grandfather's home was the home to which I would turn when things got a little hectic in my own family life, as often happened. Right? See, we all come from dysfunctional families. The only difference between me and some of y'all is I'm real clear on it, and I'm in therapy. And my therapist said I should tell you that because that shit is therapeutic. So there it is. So my grandparents' house is where I would go when things got a little tight in my home. And so she was very helpful in that regard, just keeping me alive. But in addition to that, very instrumental in the way I understand the world, very instrumental in my hatred of, condemnation of racism. She wasn't an activist. I don't want to give the impression that she was, but she was just very clear and always had been from a very long time about the unacceptability of racism. She had learned to speak to that unacceptability very early at the age of 16 when she stood up to her own father, my great-grandfather, who was a member of the Klan, after she fell in love with the man who would become my grandfather, who was Jewish, which normally does not go over well at the Clavern meeting. Right? And so when she was 16, in 1936, I beg to remind you, not a time when young Southern girls talk to their daddies this way, she went to him one evening and said, because she was in love with this Jew and insisted she was going to be with him, and she was tired of his anti-black racism that she had heard far too much in her young life, she went to him and said that he had two choices that night. Choice number one was he was going to take his robes and his hood out of the closet into the front yard and burn them. That night, he was going to quit the Klan the next day. Or choice number two, she was going to take his robes and his hood out of the closet into the front yard. She was going to burn them that night, and he was still going to quit the Klan the next day. There was no third choice. And my great-grandfather, challenged as he was by the 16-year-old freedom fighter even in 1936, did as he was told. He took his robes, his hood into the front yard, burned them, quit the Klan, changed his life, accepted the man who would become, bless you, who would become my grandfather into his life. And at that point, my grandmother decided, well, this shit is easy. Like, damn, like challenging racism is easy, y'all. Like, come on, so I'll just do it again. So 21 years later, she and my grandfather looking for a house, 1956, 57 in Nashville. There's a real estate agent, shows them a house, says, you'll like this house. There are no black people in this neighborhood. He, of course, didn't use the term black people. Right? She looked at him and said, I'm going to give you two choices today. My grandmother was a big fan of the multiple choice quiz. She believed in giving racists, an out. She was very ecumenical in that way. And she said, I'll give you two choices. Choice number one, you're going to get in your car and you're going to drive your ass out of here. Choice number two, I'm going to get in my car, I'm going to run your ass over. You pick. There is no third choice. He left. They didn't buy that house, needless to say. And again, many other times throughout her life in front of me, she would stand up for what was right. And so it rubbed off, and I think it had an impact on all of her children and her grandkids. But in any event, that's not really the point of the story. The point of the story is the last couple of years of her life, she had Alzheimer's, and that's ultimately the disease that would take her from us. Right? It's a fascinating disease. If you ever took care of anyone who has it, or you know anyone, you know it's a fascinating disease. And the part that we all know about, which is the memory loss, that is by far the most benign of the symptoms. Right? In fact, there's something, and no one will understand this who hasn't experienced it, there's something almost hauntingly beautiful and romantic about the memory loss piece. And that won't make sense to you if you haven't experienced it. And even if you have, maybe you see it differently. But there's something hauntingly romantic and beautiful about the forgetting of who one is all the way back to literally an infant state. Because the way you die with Alzheimer's, just to simplify it a little bit, you basically forget how to do everything in sort of reverse order, and you forget how to breathe, and you die. That's sort of how it goes, right? So she had Alzheimer's, and the memory loss was disturbing, but what was really disturbing was the other stuff that happens when you have that disease. The rage, the insecurity, the paranoia, the lashing out, the hostility, right? Because it makes sense. You're losing your mind, and you sort of know you're losing your mind. You don't know exactly how or why, but you don't know who all these people are who are poking and prodding you, trying to give you medicine, talking to you, telling you about some vacation you can't remember, telling them that they're your kids. It's sort of scary. Right? And so you lash out, yell at them. She did that to me, all the grandkids, all her children. She did it to her nurses as well, who were taking care of her, responsible for keeping her alive. And I should point out, the last 2.5 years of her life, all those nurses were black women. All of them. The ones responsible for keeping her a carbon-based life form, feeding her, making sure she didn't burn the house down because she smoked cigarettes and fall asleep, So they were responsible for keeping her alive. And as a woman who was going through Alzheimer's and the progression of that disease, having fear and anger and insecurity, she lashed out at them as well. And I ask you to ask yourself, what word do you think she used for them when she was angry and when she lashed out, keeping in mind who I just told you she had been since the age of 16? Because here was a woman who couldn't remember how to wipe her own ass, couldn't remember how to pour a glass of water for herself, couldn't remember who her husband had been, who any of her children or grandchildren had been, but by God, she never, ever forgot the word that you call black folks in this country when the chips are down. It was embedded in her memory. Regardless of who she had been when she was healthy and able to resist the disease, it had been sitting back there in the back of her mind like a ticking time bomb waiting to reassert. And when she was no longer healthy enough to choose resistance, it reasserted and it exploded. It was the last word that I heard her utter before she stopped talking at all, 2.5 days before she died. And when I talked to a doctor about this weeks later, who's an expert on Alzheimer's and dementia, he said, Tim, the things that we remember last are the things that we knew best. Let me say it again. The things that we remember last are the things that we knew best. And I insist to you, this is not a story about Alzheimer's. It's not about Alzheimer's, because it doesn't take Alzheimer's, does it, to put most of us in a state of fear and anxiety and insecurity and rage. We all fall into that from time to time. So the point of this story is not what will happen to you if you have that disease. Some will have that story, some will not. But we are all susceptible when the chips are down to going back to our conditioning. And you don't have to have a clan daddy to teach you that. You just got to be in this country, a country that has taught us all very subtly the same lessons, however much more indirect, that clan father told my grandmother. We can never, ever be content that we are so woke, so down, so together, so with it that we have it figured out, because we are all capable of falling back into the patterns that this society gave us. If we want to be better than that, and if we want our country to be better than that, we have to be honest with others, and most importantly, we have to be honest with ourselves and commit to making this campus, this city, this state, and this country great, not again.
Now, after carefully listening to Tim Wise give his thoughts concerning seeking justice through stories, the politics of fear, here is my deep critical analysis with regards to the video. So we are going to contextualize the video, and I'm going to give you my deep critical analysis as promised. Now, fear as a political instrument. That is what we are going to first discuss. Tim Wise argues that fear is not merely an emotional response, but it is a deliberate political instrument employed to maintain social hierarchies and justify oppressive policies. The fear of the other person is often constructed along racial, ethnic, or religious lines, which serves to consolidate power among the dominant groups. In the American context, this has historically manifested through demonization of Black Americans, from slavery and Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration and police violence. Now, by tracing the lineage of fear-based politics, Tim Wise situates contemporary racial issues within a broader historical framework. Tim Wise underscores how political elites have long manipulated racial anxieties to distract the majority population from economic injustices. For instance, poor and working-class white Americans have often been incited to view Black people as threats to their economic security, despite sharing many of the same material concerns. This strategic division prevents cross-racial solidarity and allows those in power to escape accountability. Now, when someone is corrupt, they'll just point at the Black Americans. If they squandered money, they'll just point at the Black Americans. When they unalive one another, they'll point to the Black Americans. And so for this reason, fear develops among the white Americans. And now they start seeing we Black people living in the US as a threat to them. So you see how the system has now made fear as a weapon of suppression. Now, once they fear us, they call the police. You know how the story continues from there. Now, moreover, politicians and media outlets have consistently exploited national tragedies and economic downturns to stroke public fear and redirect anger towards minorities. After the 9/11, for instance, Muslim and Arab Americans were targeted through surveillance and hate crimes, illustrating how the fear of foreign other people, foreign in quotations, can be harnessed to legitimize authoritarian policies. Narrative power and historical amnesia. A central theme in Tim Wise's presentation is the power of narrative. Stories shape collective memory and national identity. The stories that society tell about themselves can either uphold systems of oppression or challenge them. Tim Wise points out that America's dominant historical narrative often obscure or sanitize its legacy of racial violence. This collective amnesia is forgetfulness, right? So this collective forgetfulness not only distorts history, but it also impedes progress by denying the ongoing impact of past injustices. Tim Wise insists that telling the truth about history is not an act of divisiveness, but a prerequisite for reconciliation and justice. He emphasizes the importance of centering the voices and experiences of those affected by these systemic injustice. Through storytelling, he does so. Marginalized communities assert their humanity and resist dehumanization. So it is really important we have characters like Tim Wise, characters who are able to speak and to point out to other people whatever practice that we are told is okay is not okay. Those people we are practicing these things unto are just as humans as we are. They are just as citizens as we are. And it's important that Tim Wise continue doing his oration or oratory, whatever the name. Is it oratory or public speaking? It is very, very important. Now let's proceed. The refusal to engage with history fosters ignorance and embodies revisionist ideologies. It allows for the continued erasure of indigenous genocides, the horrors of slavery, and the brutal enforcement of segregation. By confronting these truths, societies can begin to dismantle the myths and underpin systemic inequality. Then we have the next subheading to be the criminalization of blackness. You see, this is also a branch of politics of fear. You know, you criminalize blackness and you glorify whiteness. One of the most perennial outcomes of fear-based politics, according to Tim Wise, is the criminalization of blackness. Media representation and political rhetorics have long associated black identity with danger and defiance. And this is, by the way, this is so much pushed by Hollywood. A black man is always given the villain character. A black person is always given the demon character, right? There's a movie called The Terminator. Not The Terminator, The Predator. The Predator is a creature from space. He comes into Earth and he starts hunting human beings. And this creature is having dreads. The people that we know are having dreads are the black people. And this predator is an invader, right? Now, a white person comes and kills it. And then he takes the head and hangs it like a trophy. Now, the person who kills it is a white man. This is painting a certain image about black people, you know? So one of the most perennial outcomes of fear-based politics, according to Wise, is the criminalization of blackness. Media representation and political rhetorics have long associated black identity with danger and defiance. This narrative justifies discriminatory policing, harsh sentencing, and the disproportionate incarceration of black Americans. Tim Wise draws attention to how political campaigns have exploited fear for electoral gain. He references the infamous Willie Horton from the 1988 presidential race, which used racially charged imagery to stoke white fears and sway voters. Similar tactics continue to be employed, often subtly, in contemporary politics. The result is a public discourse that pathologizes black communities while ignoring the structural roots of inequality. Beyond political messaging, the media plays a crucial role in reinforcing these associations. News coverage disproportionately highlights black suspects in crime stories, fostering an implicit bias in public perception. This bias manifests in lethal policing practices and judicial outcomes that disproportionately harm black individuals. Then we have the part of education and the miseducation. Another critical dimension is when Tim Wise said that education is used in perpetuating fear-based narratives. The school's curricula often omit or whitewash histories of slavery, colonialism, and resistance. This miseducation fosters ignorance and reinforces racial hierarchies. Tim Wise advocates for a racial reimagination of education, one that is honest, inclusive, and oriented towards justice. He stresses the need for critical pedagogy that equips students to question dominant narratives and understand the social political forces shaping their lives. Only through such education can society dismantle the ideological foundation of fear and build more equitable futures. In classrooms across America, the separation of topics like critical race theory and ethnic studies highlights the ongoing battle over historical truth. By marginalizing these discourses, states perpetuate the myth of a post-racial society, shielding students from understanding the deeply embedded nature of systemic racism. Structural inequality and fear is another thing as well. In times of economic uncertainty, fear is often redirected towards scapegoated groups. Immigrants, refugees, and Black Americans are blamed for job loss and economic decline. Despite overwhelming evidence that structural forces such as automation, globalization, and neoliberal policies are the real culprits, and not Black people or the marginalized groups, sometimes it's easier to blame than to find a solution. This misdirection serves as the interest of the economic elite by deflecting scrutiny and maintaining the status quo. Tim Wise warns us that. Tim Wise, he warns us against the dangers of such scapegoating, urging a reorientation of public discourse towards systemic analysis and solidarity. Policies such as reform, the war on drugs, and voter suppression laws are often cloaked in languages that appeal to economic responsibility while masking racial target intentions. These policies reflect how fear-driven narratives influence legislation, disproportionately affecting minority groups while upholding white economic privilege, right? Now, there's a lot that Tim Wise continues to say in this video. So far, I'm going to stop at this point, but you can come to understand that Tim Wise is indeed a wise man with whom he has shared with us so much. We can learn so much that we can relate to. And here is something that he said. Education is not the greatest equalizer. Education is the greatest inequalizer, the opposite now of equalizer. America was not made for the Black Americans. America was made for the whites. And that is why the system favors the whites and does not favor the blacks and also the marginalized groups. Education cannot be individualized. He continues to say, it will lose its core values if it's about a group afflict, if it's about an individual group, or if it's about an individual culture. Education should be multi. Education should not have a scope and a limitation. It should be broad-based. Tim Wise warns us about that. I hope that you get value from all this that we do, from the videos. I'll surely appreciate for your support. Kindly subscribe. Check me on Patreon. Support me over there. I have 39 members. Only 3 are paying. 36 are there for free. But you know, your subscription helps me bring more quality content and good stories to you. Thank you. This is EFK Original Documentaries. See you in the next one.